Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's performance will include 9th century boomers, 12th century robots, and futuristic applications of 21st century tech. All this and more as we discuss projection mapping on this episode of Created Things.
Welcome to this episode of Created Things. I'm your host, Father Gabriel Torretta, Dominican priest, graduate student, and human being. This is also today I have here my co-host, whom I have here every day, who is Jacob Flores Popchek, artist and psychotherapist. How you doing today?
I like that you left out that I'm a human being. It's raising a lot of questions in our listeners' mind. Is he an alien? Is Jacob an alien? And to that I say, yes.
Could be. But you know, Jacob, I wanted to say that today I want to celebrate at the very beginning something on the show, which we haven't really had a chance to celebrate yet, which is that I think most of our listeners don't know that this is probably the only podcast on the planet that is not a mime.
Not a mime? Tell me, what do you mean?
Yeah, so you remember, like, you can have many different things in a podcast. Like, you can have singing, you can have poetry, you can have various things. But like, most people wouldn't think of, like, maybe we could have a totally audio media system that could be all done in mime, which we talked about and rejected because we decided that we wanted our podcast to be not mime. And so while mimes don't appear on most podcasts, I think ours is probably the only one that is not mime.
Right. Yeah. Just decidedly from the beginning.
Yeah. From the like, it's like a principle that we made, which I really committed to, actually.
Right. Yeah. And although you are joking, this is actually a funny joke because I don't know if you know this. I'm classically trained in mime.
Well, that's another thing that happens in the world that is funny and is real. It's funny as it was because it's true, actually. So yes, there is such a thing as, quote, classically trained in mime. By the way, I am personally myself not classically trained in mime. You could say it's more of kind of a free modern spirit of mime. I would say my relationship to mime is kind of like liturgical dance's relationship to ballet. Everyone wishes it hadn't happened. I think that's what I'd say. Yeah.
Oh, God. Well, you're queuing up basically 2 episodes that we need to do. One entirely on mime and one entirely on liturgical dance. But neither of those topics are what we're covering today.
No, that's true. Yeah, that's true. But before we do get into the topic which we have to formally discuss today, which is hot and juicy and other good but also double entendre kind of words, I have been spending a lot of my life recently reading Latin poetry from this really boss dude who lived in the early 9th century. In fact, it is the 1200th anniversary of his death in like a couple of weeks. So this is a big thing.
Oh, yes, no, there's like a siren in the. Is there an emergency? Are you dying?
I live in a house with some old friars, and so whenever I hear a siren that gets close like that one, there's always a possibility it stopped at my house, but I don't know. Right. So anyway, as we were,
God, please bless the person for whom that siren is.
Amen.
Anyway, you're saying about poets from the 9th century.
Yeah, so I've been reading this poet who died in like 821, and whose name is Théodulphe of Orléans.
No way. That's what I'm going to name my first child.
Yes, I think you should, because Théodulphe is an amazing name, and he's an amazing human being.
Is that the male version? Side note: is that the male version of Theodora? Would Theodora be like the female version of Theodulphe?
No, I think they think.
Oh, I guess Theodora.
As far as I know, they'd be unrelated. Yeah, probably Theodore.
Obviously.
But it can be really hard to tell whether these Visigothic names are male or female, just by looking at them.
Jess and I have, with our producer of this podcast, Kyle, been watching on Netflix The Haunting of Hill House, which is like the scariest ghost show I've ever seen, and one of the coolest characters in the show is named Theodora, so I've got that name in my mind. That's why.
That's awesome. Oh, wow. Makes me almost want to see it. So the reason I was thinking about this, or the reason it caught my attention, is because in among lots of different things that Theodulf talks about, he writes this poem that is literally about how you can tell just by looking that the world, it's end times and the world is about to end. Okay. And how do you know it? Because of climate change.
Okay, wait. So to clarify, we have a 9th century poet, a monk? Are we to assume this is a monk?
He is a bishop.
He's a bishop. So that we have this 9th century bishop writing poetry decrying climate change.
Decrying climate change. Saying that you know the world is about to end because of climate change. So, like, I'm just going to give you a really brief paraphrase of some of the first stanzas in this poem. He says, everyone can tell that the world is going to fall away into ruin. Even if it doesn't speak, you can tell just because of its problems. It doesn't speak by words, but just by the things it does. So we no longer have the temperate kind of winter we used to have that would allow grain and wood and seeds that had been sown to spring up in the spring. In the summer, we don't have the good heat of the sun that we used to have fitting for labor. In the fall, the fruit of the vine isn't anywhere near as abundant as it used to be, and autumn isn't marked by being weighed down by the burden of heavy fruits. And it just goes on and on and on like this about how, like, you can tell because the seasons have changed. The way they're supposed to be isn't how they are anymore, and therefore the world is gonna end.
That's amazing. Is there like a little illuminated manuscript illustration of a polar bear in the margins?
It's sad because there was, but actually the polar ice cap he was on melted off the page and it's not there anymore.
Oh my gosh, that's terrible.
I know, it's sad. Things are real, Jacob. You know, these aren't jokes. You know, the world ended in 821.
Now, you mentioned off air that there were two things that this poet talked about that you said were very modern in their essence. Obviously the climate change, global warming reference poem is one. There's another one too.
Oh, in the same poem, he's like, you know who sucks? Millennials. They're the worst. They're the worst. Now, strictly speaking,
like, when you say millennials, you mean people in several centuries are gonna suck, or?
Well, yeah. So strictly speaking, you can't really say millennials because the first millennium hasn't come yet, and so people don't know like what a drag millennials are. But he says basically, he's like, kids these days, they just like, they don't do their duty, you know? They just like keep quitting jobs, you know? They're just like, oh yeah, it's amazing. They said like they're not consistent, you know? They won't just like do their work. They're doing their own thing, you know?
So not the classic like, kids these yeah, so not the classic like kids these days, but literally like some of the things that boomers complain about millennials for.
Oh yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. No, it's exactly it. Oh yeah, here's the line. Like, rarely do you find a worker who is like stalwart in everything that he does. Nothing is fixed anymore. No one's fixed anymore. No one stays where he was like they used to.
Wait, are you live translating this as you're reading this?
I am, yeah.
Okay, do us the privilege of reading that line back in Latin, because I got to hear that.
Rarior officium consistitit in omne minister quam prius et fixum nil stat ut antestetit.
Oh my God. This is how smart
my Latin accent is terrible, so there it is.
No, come on. That's smart as heck, dude.
But yeah, so my point is just how is this a thing that this guy is brilliant. I love him, which I should because I'm spending a lot of time studying him, but it's like not even 821 when he writes, and he's like, you know who basically sucks is like millennials, they're the worst. And then like, you know, it's awful how like climate change means that the world is going to end. And I just think like normally poets from 1200 years ago do not write quite exactly so directly the things that like you find on Twitter.
Yeah, that's really crazy and worth just like a lot of thought and prayer, because obviously, you know, folks like you and I say that culture is sort of cyclical and nothing is really new, and everything we're complaining about, we've complained about before. But gosh, that's a that's kind of a really extreme example. I don't even know if you and I thought that it was that crazy.
It is genuinely worth reflecting on, I think, because, like, you know, pretty frequently, because I'm a priest, you know, people will sort of come up to me and they'll be like, don't you think the world is really gonna end? You know, because in fact, this happened just a couple weeks ago. Somebody very unexpected was like, I mean, don't you just think that, like, this is it? Like, look, these are end times, you know, like, we've got fires and we've got these wars and we've got these earthquakes and these hurricanes and, like, the pandemic and all this kind of stuff. And frankly, it's things like this, it's texts like this, it's guys like Theodulf who I mean, I'm joking about millennials, but he's 120 years before people start to get excited and apocalyptic about the millennium. Like, he's not even at that point. And he's having similar thoughts, you know, like, we just need perspective, right? We genuinely need some perspective here, that if we think like, oh my gosh, I look and there's this like bad hurricane in Louisiana, and then like there's this absolute catastrophe, horrible humanitarian nightmare in Afghanistan, and then like California's on fire, and then there's this pandemic, which I hate, and then like I can conclude from that, like, therefore this is end times in the sense that, like, I think Christ is going to come tomorrow. Mm-hmm. We have drawn an unhelpful. Everything is true up until the point where we draw the unhelpful conclusion.
Right.
Because, like, you know, just look at the book of Revelation, man. I mean, like, the whole point of the book of Revelation is that the conditions of possibility for the second coming always, literally always exist.
Right.
That's the point. That's the point.
You know, at which you can conclude a lot from. You know, you'd sort of take what I tend to infer, which is just like what we would sort of call the end times, just all of the times, you know, that we're all sort of in our own perpetual personal end times where we will eventually die and meet Christ. Or you can argue that more literally, you know, the end times have been going on ever since Christ. Or you can argue or that just Revelation itself is a analogy for, you know, how hard shit is. but
yeah,
the whole like, oh, Jesus coming back tomorrow, and I know that because I saw polar bear melt, and, you know, there's a pandemic, and et cetera and so forth. Yeah, it's really problematic. Yeah, it's just like this is what's crazy. The time of the church is the end times, period. When the time of the church ends, the world ends, and that's the end of the story, you know? Mm-hmm. Like, which is wild, but like, end times begins with the ascension, and it ends with the second coming. So end times are the times of the church, period. Right. And personally,
which is great. Like, it's cool. It's exciting.
Well, and personally, my time ends when I encounter Jesus by dying. So, like,
true.
I also never understand the panic over the end times, because it's like, you're gonna experience an end times. That's kind of a given. You're either going to experience a personal solo end time, or you're going to experience it with everybody else. So kind of calm down, like the inevitability of your personal end time. And also, if you're experiencing the end time with everybody else, it's still your personal end time. So are you going to care you're experiencing with everybody else? Like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
It's true. Although what you have just said reminds me, I'm thinking of what changes when you're experiencing things with a bunch of different people all at once. And that makes me think about
oh God, are you
scenes in movies with people in discos doing a bunch of E, which makes me think of our actual topic for today.
That was the worst transition I've ever heard in my life.
Hold on. It was literally not a transition. I actually just narrated to you 3/4 of the actual thought process that went behind it. So if you think it's a terrible transition, like, I don't care. That's actually how my brain works. How dare you? I am a person. Okay. The remaining 1/4, which will make all things clear, it will not make all things clear. That will make all things clear. I don't want to give out of time, so I'll bring it up when it comes up. Okay.
Well, that was very opaque of you. I mean, like, that was so
thank
opaque,
you.
I didn't even know what you meant. But
good.
I do think
you're
right that it's time to transition into our podcast topic for today.
Jacob, we've already transitioned into it.
Okay, sorry. It's time that we acknowledge that we have, or that I do.
Thank you. Yes.
Which our listeners will know from the title of this episode, and we haven't named yet, but I will. We're talking today about projection mapping, which
I have to say, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. When Jacob first proposed, like, why don't we talk about projection mapping? He's like an artist and a psychotherapist, hence the introduction. And I was thinking, like, okay, is this some kind of like Jungian archetype free association thing where we like draw things on a board and we draw like maps to them, like the conspiracy theory gif with like all these kind of red lines to things. I was kind of afraid that we were going to talk about that kind of projection and kind of mapping,
like astral projection.
Or astral projection, or maybe like, I hate my dad and you remind me of my dad, so I'm angry at you and I hate you kind of projection.
Right. Okay. I do think that'd be a cool episode.
Narrator, I don't hate my dad.
No. Mapping your astral projections would be a cool episode, albeit one we're completely unqualified to discuss.
I'm pretty sure that's called Doctor Strange, and it's already like, Benedict Cumberbatch has already done the whole thing,
Right, yeah. But no, we're talking about projection mapping because I thought this would be a fun topic precisely because you have no experience with it at all. So I sent you a bunch of videos and articles and things prior to this podcast. I, however, am kind of obsessed with it. It's kind of the hot thing in theme parks. Fireworks are expensive and cause fires sometimes. So a lot of parks are kind of leaving behind fireworks and going towards this thing, projection mapping, but it's also a big thing in city centers and holiday events and all sorts of things. Basically to give listeners, if you're not familiar with this idea, just like I'll give you the kind of 500-foot flyover summary. Projection mapping is kind of this intersection of engineering and art, where an artist of some kind goes and literally scans some kind of all the weird surfaces of a unorthodoxically surfaced thing, and they put it into a computer as data points, and then they build some kind of animation or video projection over top of that. So literally, like I guess the common example is, I'll go find a building somewhere, a very architecturally complex building, and I will scan the data points of that building based on their distance in relationship to my projector or projectors plural, if I want to do like a really vivid, cool, intricate show. And I'm going to put those into a computer as a series of data points so that I can basically turn that building, in this example, into a screen, into an interactive screen. And so a lot of different places have taken advantage of this technology. I was mentioning theme parks before. Most famously, Disneyland, Walt Disney World do like a big projection mapping show on Cinderella's castle or Sleeping Beauty's castle, where the castle itself becomes kind of a screen where the characters and the animations interact with the architectural elements. But lots of other places have done it too. Notre Dame Cathedral has done it. The Stonehenge did a big giant one where all the different stones turn into the screens. We're going to talk about a couple other big places, but I mentioned Notre Dame, and specifically the reason we're talking about this is because a lot of churches are doing this. A lot of churches are letting their complex architectures be utilized for both religious and secular projection mapping displays. And it's sort of like very underground right now, as evidenced by the fact that you, Father, didn't know about this, but it's becoming increasingly popular, in part because it's kind of a one-time upfront investment with like a lot of possibilities for doing the show over and over and over again. And so I want to talk about kind of that trend in regards to churches and what our thoughts on that are. And personally, one idea that I have to maybe kind of push that idea further. So with that explanation aside, I sent you some videos, just kind of overall, what was your impression of seeing this technology and this art form in use for the first time?
Well, I thought it was fascinating. Of course, I mean, obviously, like I know a lot of the drama of it is like physically being there, seeing these things that are, whatever, like a 3, 4, 5, 6 story tall building, or some of the ones, this like gigantic skyscraper in Taiwan or something like this. I say like there's a certain physicality of it, of the experience, and an immersiveness that's clearly part of it. So when you're watching on the YouTubes, like it's not quite the same thing, but still you get the concept, you get kind of what's happening, and there's a lot to it that's super, super interesting. I did one thing that was really interesting, and I think there'd be a lot to talk about here, is that at least the ones that I saw were basically more successful the more they were narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Like it seemed to run risks as a non-narrative kind of art form. So this is the missing 1/4 of the transition that was legitimately the transition in my mind, which was that like some of them honestly just kind of looked like extremely, extremely expensive, like flash video music visualizations to like techno from the 90s,
or like Windows screensavers.
Yeah, like there were a couple in particular where I was looking at this and like I could tell this is elaborate. I mean, like it's a huge thing. It's spread over this gigantic like block long building. It looks really cool. At the same time, it is literally just the exact same thing as like when I was in high school and this friend of mine was telling me how somebody sent him a link to this like early flash visualizer and told him like, take 2 hits of acid and watch this, and that was like the whole point, was just to like listen to techno music and like see flashing lights and like literally trip out
and call the doctor in the morning.
Yeah, exactly. So like some of that stuff I thought like, trying to get any kind of initial exploration of like, what is this as an art form? What is this as like what are its strengths? What are its weaknesses at the present moment? Just from what I could tell from kind of like trying to look at a bunch of these things at once and try to imagine what it would be like to be a part of them, etc. That was certainly one thing that struck me right away, was that like more narrative seemed better, less narrative seemed like to struggle with the specificity of the art form.
Right. Now, I will say this in response to that. I don't disagree with you. Personally, aesthetically, I enjoy more narrative anything. But in particular, more narrative projection mapping shows where I'm walking up to a building and I'm seeing a story or a history of some kind laid out either via animation or video on the surface of this structure. But I do think that in defense of the more amorphous, symbolic kind of Windows 95 stuff you're talking about, they're made for those kinds of projection mapping performances are made for a fundamentally different type of viewership where I already brought up the example of Cinderella's castle getting projection mapped at Walt Disney World. That's obviously a narrative performance. I'm at the end of the night before I leave the park. I'm kind of gathering in front of the castle and I'm observing these things happen, and they play the music and I leave, right? As opposed to the kind of Windows 95 projection on the skyscraper in Taiwan that you mentioned. That's going off for maybe 2 to 5 minutes at a time randomly throughout the night. So the idea is that I'm just walking along doing my business, and then this huge piece of installation art just arrives very kind of ephemerally, and I stop and I watch this thing and I'm taken aback by it, and then I sort of move on. So there's almost this idea behind some of those projection mapping performances where they are very abstract, but they are that way because they don't intend to capture the audience gaze and make them stay. Their intention is to basically slow you down and appreciate the architecture of the space around you. We were talking about in our last episode, about ways to like find beauty in your life, and one of the points you made was just stop and kind of studying something, stopping and just really observing something, and that was actually part of what inspired me to suggest this topic, was that some of those more abstract ones are actually trying to get people to do that. This big gray blob of a building that you normally ignore, suddenly it's lit up with 1,000 bizarre symbols, and you're going to stand there in the middle of your commute back home at night, and you're going to watch that.
Oh, that's really thank you. That's a really helpful perspective. And you know what it makes me think of in context is like, it's funny. Like, so in Vienna, there's this, clock. It's this gigantic, famous clock. I don't know when it's from. It's a Baroque era clock. I don't know exactly
like a
what century.
cuckoo clock or.
Well, it's like like this. It's probably 100 yards long, but yes, like a cuckoo clock. So it's big. It's a substantial portion of the like third floor of a building or something, and it's over an arch, I believe. And so when it goes off. I mean, it's a clock, so when it goes off at I forget, it's either at the hour or 5 past the hour or something like this. It's a big. I mean, it's a literal clockwork wonder, so when it goes off at a certain time every hour, all of this stuff gets set into motion, so these figures come kind of whirling out, and then there's a prince, and then there's a queen, and then there's like, a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker, all these things kind of come whirling out, and all of this. And of course they have absolutely nothing to do with telling you the time. I mean, the time is there, but like, but there's like dongs for that, I mean, like ding dong. And also if you're close enough, you can just physically look at it. So you don't need all this stuff to tell you the time, but it's this marvel. I mean, it's a technological marvel in the 21st century, let alone, in maybe, I forget, I don't know when it was built, 17th, 18th century. It's a marvel, and like, why does it exist? Like, well, in part, it exists like to serve the purpose that it serves in, 2021 in Vienna, which is like, it's just a nice square like any other square, and then like, in the like quarter hour that leads up to that thing that happens every hour, like a bunch of people start to gather, and they come, and some people will be like hustling and walking on through, and then when it starts, like everybody stops.
Yeah. Well,
they just stare at this thing for like 10 minutes.
I don't want to harp,
and then they go back their day.
I don't want to harp on the Disney thing, but Disney references, I think, that clock specifically, but in general, cuckoo clocks, when they build It's a Small World, first at the I believe it's Chicago World's Fair, and then rebuild it at Disneyland. So. And again, I think it's actually once every 15 minutes, this giant facade that's a big old cuckoo clock, stops, and a bunch of little figures come out and play their trumpets. And to connect it back to what we're talking about now, at Christmas, they projection map that as a giant Christmas present that once an hour gets unwrapped as a different thing. And
that is cool. Yeah, that's cool.
It's actually seamlessly bleeding the kind of old school version of this phenomenon that you're talking about, with that kind of neo version of it that's rolling out now very technologically. So it's cool that you'd observe that. I do, and that's why I love the projection mapping thing, because it feels like an evolution of so many ancient art forms, things that we've really left behind in a lot of ways. And we're going to talk about this within a liturgical setting, but things that we've left behind in a lot of ways artistically, like, nobody's going to build a giant ornate cuckoo clock in the middle of a city center now, right? But I think there's something very human about wanting that kind of beautiful public art interruption, in the middle of my day, or in the middle of my evening or whatever. And I see projection mapping as being a very modern answer to that desire. And as such, kind of the great grandchild of a lot of these very intricate art forms that we maybe as a culture have lost.
I think that's interesting. let me broach a concern I have about it, or something that like caught my attention that I think is marks it out from the kind of older style of like public installation art, like this cuckoo clock, or like, you know, big fountains, or these kinds of things that we could talk about, older forms of automata, and stuff. Of course, these things don't really run by themselves. Like, people have to take care of them, and they have to like change the gears, and they have to oil things, and they have to do all this kind of stuff. But that being said, like the actual amount of once the thing is built and like designed and built and put into place, the amount of effort that's needed to keep it together, like keep it actually running, is relatively speaking low.
You're talking about
like,
things like cuckoo clocks and stuff right now, right?
things like cuckoo clocks, things like old automata, old fountains, these kinds of things. Like,
they're fairly self-sustaining.
They're fairly self-sustaining, and they, as a result, generate around themselves this sense of permanence. It's funny because they have this kind of like both wonder and awe that something has happened, but also this perpetual permanence that they like generate around themselves. That, like, you know, if you know, one walks to Vienna, this is a particular square in Vienna in like 2021, and you're like, there are many layers of amazement, and one layer of amazement is that like this thing has been around since whatever century, and it's still there, and it still works, and like people are still caring for it, and that's still beautiful, you know. At the really extreme end of like low maintenance is, you know, something like Stonehenge, which obviously Stonehenge is not installation art, but nonetheless, it's still it's a work of human hands that like people did have to care for, and do to this day have to care for in one way. It's just like the amount of care for it is like way far low. The amount of care and maintenance that you need for a projection mapping display and installation, like I want to think of this all as part of the same like art form, mental space, human reality. But a thing that I find kind of a limitation of the genre, a limitation of the art form, is how much maintenance and how much involvement it requires, like all the time, you know?
What, projection mapping itself?
Projection mapping itself.
Well, how do you figure? Because, I mean, my experience with it is that, you know, once you design it for the facade, you know, someone's basically coming and hitting play, you know, for most of the time. I mean, certainly if you wanted to update it. Now, I agree with you, there's a lack of permanence there, in the sense that I find it really hard to believe that in 500 years someone's going to go to, you know, Notre Dame Cathedral and see exactly the same projection mapping show that they're seeing today. So I think that connection across generations is absent, and I think that's a legitimate point. But I'm missing what you're saying in terms of like upkeep or maintenance, because it seems like it's similarly low maintenance to the automata that you're talking about.
Oh no, you read me right. I'm thinking like 500 years from now. I'm thinking generations ahead.
I see.
And maybe you can say like that's just not that relevant. The point is like we live when we live right now. But I think like maybe let me back up, presupposition here, public art, public installation art has a certain, I think part of its nature is that it has a certain longing, calling out from like the past and the present and the future. Like it has a certain way of shaping them and connecting them all together. And it's not bad for things to be totally transitory. It's just like we recognize that there's a limitation here. So like, sure. I think it's good to put it, I want to put it by genre in that same context of, like I said, like Stonehenge, this cuckoo clock, 12th century automata, like these kinds of things. And one thing that is characteristic of this is that as powerful and like immersive as it is to be in it right at the moment, it is ephemeral and it won't last.
No, I think it's a legitimate critique, and I think that's one of the factors that's going to play into a lot of our conversations, we've got a couple other episodes in the pipeline that we're kind of tossing around about other art forms, certain genres of movie and certain, types of, painting and different things like this. And one of the questions that I want to be repeatedly asking in this podcast that I hope will kind of set us apart from other artistic podcasts, certainly, however, unfortunately, other Christian podcasts, is that I never want to just say, oh, this is what's wrong with the thing and leave that there. Part of these is I want to brainstorm with you. Okay, so, with our Catholic ideas on what art and beauty are, could we even do one better? Could we even improve upon this? And so I think the critique that, there is something inherently ephemeral about projection mapping shows, whereas one of the real beauties in public art is its staying power. I think it's a legitimate critique, and it's one that if we can come up with, at least hypothetically, ways to address that within the art form of projection mapping, I think that's a really cool line of conversation. I do also want to comment, though, on what you're saying about the staying power of public art, because it isn't something I've thought about before. But you're super right that all art is, to some degree, inherently ephemeral and made to be so. I mean, if I go to an art museum, there are traveling exhibits, right? Those paintings are not going to be there forever, intentionally so. If I go to a cinema, the movies that I see this week are not going to be the movies that are playing in 3 weeks, right? If I go to the theater, the play or the ballet or the, opera or whatever is not going to be the same performance today that I saw a year ago, right? So all art forms pretty much in relation to how human and actively human they are pretty by definition fleeting, but public art has the most staying power, because public art I always thought of as just being something that's supposed to unite a community, right? I have this statue or this fountain, or as you said, the automata in the middle of my town, and it gives us a sense of identity, and we gather around it, and maybe it's the center for festivals and some kind of cultural identity and shared experience. But you're right, you're adding this other layer of, it doesn't just connect the community in the present, it connects the community across time.
Yeah.
And that's actually, I don't want to make this a discussion about some of the more political conversations that are being had right now in regards to public art. I think there are very good discussions on both sides, or arguments on both sides, in regards to, certain types of statues and things that some people feel like should be removed, some people feel like they shouldn't. But one of the comments that maybe isn't being made so much in that conversation, and one that I think I'm glad we're applying to this one, is how are we connecting ourselves not only to our community now, but to our community then and to our community in the future? How are we using art to cross time? And if we are going to, if we're going to get rid of one, or if we're going to evolve out of one, what are we going to replace it with? That's just an interesting value judgment that I hadn't considered before.
Yeah. And typically for me, of course, I proposed it in the mode of a criticism, but it doesn't necessarily actually have to be. I just, as you're talking and thinking about it, so it's a limitation about the nature of the art form. And so we're not going to be able, no one is going to be able to use the art form well unless we understand its limitations. That's how art works. That's perfectly fine. So perhaps in thinking about like, how could this come to be more dramatically itself, like what kinds of uses could it be put to, like how could we find it as part of our artistic experience, whatever. I think maybe we need to expand a little bit the way in which we're thinking about it, because when I was looking at these, when I was watching these projection mapping videos, what was very clear to me is that this is closer in genre to ballet, actually specifically, and to some extent theater, but probably more with ballet. Because like what is the power of this? Like, just personally myself, again, like I haven't even seen these things in person, so I'm making these big broad claims just based on having seen some YouTube videos. Okay, so that duly acknowledged. Now to proceed on to make generalizations. How does it work? So what's the effect where you're looking at like a certain amount of like the beauty of movement, ones that I found to be most effective were ones that like really richly integrated movement and music. And then so there with the rich integration of music and movement, you have something that's very akin to certain aspects of what's happening in ballet. The ephemerality of it, the fact that like the meaning is largely contained in the meaning and the time are contained in the same thing, which is in the act of doing it. And when it's done, you carry it with you. But when it's done, it's done. And the fact of its repeatability doesn't change that fact. Like when it's done, it's done. So that's interesting that it has these elements of ephemerality and immersiveness that are similar to other established art forms. But that are not like physical visual art in the same way, you know?
Right.
But then what's interesting, like, so what's particular about this is one thing that strikes me is that but then it also does have strong elements of strictly visual art, like painting, you know, even more than cinema, you could say. I mean, perhaps you could say it's incorporating elements of cinema as well. I mean, literally moving pictures, but you get these elements of, you can see some of this effect of like, what is a moving picture? What artistic abilities are opened up by the fact that your pictures move, which is what cinema is doing in part. What artistic possibilities are opened up by the fact that we have this rich kind of visual world, which is some of the things that's happening with painting, somehow integrated also with sculpture a little bit because of it's interacting with this complex surface that is limited by the contours of the surface in a strictly and physically literal way. But then you have this like motion as poetry itself, and then you have like this immersive power of music. And I think there is something there where you like, I'm mentioning these other art forms not because I think in any kind of crass way it's a mixture of them, but because when we're discovering something new, we have to refer to things that are familiar. And like, I can recognize certain powerful artistic elements that these other genres have in this to me new form, which is very, I don't know, that's interesting. Like there's stuff there that's kind of exciting, kind of captivating.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're talking about, it's funny you mentioned ballet because we're talking about primarily the public arts application of this technology, of this art form, but there are more interactive and more theatrical applications. For instance, the Radio City Rockettes have incorporated projection mapping into their Christmas spectacular, where you see kind of New York buildings come to life and the dancers actually interact with that space. I saw a performance of My Fair Lady in Canada a few years ago, where, are you familiar with that show at all, My Fair Lady?
I mean, I know the musical. I don't know the projection mapping version of it.
Right. Well, no, I mean, it was just the musical in a theater, everything else. But there's this very famous scene in the musical where our protagonist, Eliza Doolittle, this very poor woman who's been trying to, by way of a mentor, kind of worm her way into or otherwise disguise herself as a wealthy aristocratic person. She ends up with all these aristocratic people, these very stuffy aristocratic people, at a horse race. And it was really cool the way they did it, because up until this point, everything in the show has been traditional sets, traditional costuming, everything. But all of our stuffy aristocrats roll out in their blacks and their whites and their grays, and they all kind of line up along the stage to watch the horse race, which is ostensibly, based on their positioning, supposed to be among us in the audience. We're sort of the horses they're watching. And the song that they sing in any iteration of the musical is very, very kind of a slow, somber song. We are so refined and we're going to the horse race. But then when the horses actually are released, for that like 10 seconds that they're running, the music like swells and then they all calm back down. And to emphasize that with projection mapping, they actually project these Technicolor horses in red and yellow and pink and green flashing across our cast in their blacks and their whites and their grays. So, for that quick 10 seconds that the horses are running, our cast actually gains color. And then the race,
interesting. That's cool.
and then the race is done. So there are some very theatrical and interactive elements, or applications, I guess you should say, of projection mapping. We're sort of talking about the public arts version of that. I swear to God, literally like 5 fire trucks drive past this house a day. Like, it is so annoying. Sorry. We're on the west side of Cincinnati because we hate ourselves.
Good for you.
Anyway. So back to it. We're talking about the public arts applications of this technology and this art form, but it is worth noting that I think your observations about the intersection of ballet and theater and things like that are pretty well founded and pretty well explored.
Yeah. And I just think, I think it's interesting because like well, that's how you can begin to like discover the particular contours of an art form that only it has, that's really going to allow it to be fully realized, I like, because again, we're talking about like, not just like, isn't this a cool thing, which PS it is, like, this is super cool. Like I'm excited about it. Let's be excited about it. Like but also like, just how could we imagine using it? And I think to ask questions like that, it's helpful to think of ourselves like, for instance, people with early movies, right? Like the early, like, just moving pictures, right? Where even once you get to like full stories being told, and then even when you get to like talking films, for a really long time, they're just stage sets. Like, there's just a filmed play, basically.
Yeah.
Where there are multiple takes, and it's a while before things really develop that you couldn't do. People develop storytelling techniques like that you couldn't do in theater. Doesn't mean better, just means you can't do them in theater.
Yeah, it just means unique.
Which means that they're beginning to actually discover the potentiality of this art form as an art form. And that's really cool. Like, that's really exciting. Seeing that happen is exciting.
And I think that's part of what I love so much about projection mapping is, sitting in film school, we learn, or even, I have one of my degrees is in communications, because I make poor choices, and, like studying the history of media and communications and things. I feel like it's been a while since people got to experience a brand new art form and just say, this is just pure raw potential. And I feel very privileged to be living in a time where that's happening and to be kind of viewing that in real time. I was researching a little bit the history of projection mapping, and it's so new. Literally the first projection mapping ever done was on the floating head in Disney's Haunted Mansion. Back in like the 60s or 70s. And at that point, it wasn't like data mapping. It was, they sculpted a head out of white, and then they projected a face onto it with a traditional projector and made it look like it was talking. And they're still using that effect in the Haunted Mansion now. It's the Madame Leota and the crystal ball, right? But then, since that ride was built in the 60s or 70s, now we have this evolution of it where we're scanning architecture in as data points and things like this. So I like that you're questioning, how can we use this? This is this brave new world. This is this amazing frontier. How can we use this art form? Because that's a question that I want to ask and discuss in this episode. Pretty much the main question I want to ask and discuss in this episode. But before we get to that question, there's something I wanted to run past you. You are definitely more of a classics guy than I am, right? And one of the criticisms, less so now, because people are starting to get used to it and recognize it's pretty inoffensive. But one of the initial criticisms of projection mapping as a public arts form, especially when it was being rolled out on the facades or edifices of like Notre Dame or, one of the other churches we're going to discuss, which is the Cathedral in San Antonio, Texas. One of the big criticisms there was these are these beautiful historical architectural landmarks, and you're ruining it by or cheapening it by projecting this sort of, digital wizardry magic show onto it. Now, I mean, I'll give away the goat. I don't think that. I don't believe that to be the case. But I'm also not as much of a classics guy as you are. And so I'm just curious what your response to that criticism would be. Do you think that holds water? Not so much.
Yeah, I would say certainly not in principle. Like in principle, I don't think that it makes sense to say like, well, this is a church, and so we can't like project any images on its exterior wall. I mean, like that's a weird principle, and I just don't think it doesn't really come from anywhere or go anywhere. I think like it's like anything else. If we're really talking about a sacred space, it's a sacred building, and so part of the importance of having a visually recognizable church in a public space is that it projects its sacredness out into the world, and so its sort of rough exterior surface is also part of the sacrality of its existence, and so we should act in accord with like the dignity of what this building is, like it is worse to graffiti a church than to graffiti, some other random building, right? Like just because of the physical act of what it entails, right? But okay, so we have to like pay attention to respect the nature of like this space, that it's not just a big blank wall, so to speak, but it's a church, and to respond appropriately. I think so. Okay, so does that mean that I think that absolutely every time somebody does like a kind of projection mapping thing on a church that it has to be, like a life of Jesus Christ? Like, no, I don't, I mean, we can be sophisticated about this. But it needs to be congruous with the actual thing itself, so like, I do think that like if somebody was going to propose doing a projection mapping on a church, you would need to be pretty careful about like, frankly, like any other kind of art form that is commissioned that involves a church building. It would need a lot of like, I'm not just going to say like, oh, you're an artist, go run with it. We need to have a lot of really close like patron artist conversations.
Sure.
Not just at the beginning, but like ongoing, so that we make sure that we actually understand like what this project is, like how it really works with the mission of this building as a building and what happens in it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think it's great, fantastic. I do think that there's just going to be some practical structural limitations. So like, I don't think that, just thinking off the top of my head, I think it would be very unlikely that one could find a way of deploying projection mapping, say, on the exterior of a church that could be a long-term installation.
Mm-hmm.
I think as like a particular show on like a day, or even a recurring kind of thing on a certain day of the year or whatever, like I think that could have a lot of power. But like this sort of, like you talked about with the skyscraper in Taiwan, where just like it's 1 o'clock in the morning and suddenly this thing just comes on and there it is. I was going to say I have a hard time imagining that, but actually now that I'm imagining it, I'm thinking maybe that could be kind of cool. So I don't know.
I'm glad
anyway,
you mentioned that, because, okay, so like we already said, I love this, so I watch these videos all the time. I've seen many of these things live, intentionally so. I've sought them out. I'm actually sort of halfway working on one right now. I recently completed a physical art piece, and the hope of the bar owner who commissioned this art installation is that we're gonna projection map it. It's so that's kind of a cool thing. But of the because you hadn't seen any of these things, I sent you all these videos. Of those videos, I sent you two specific ones that we kind of already referenced. One was sort of a secular application on the sacred, and one was a sacred application on the secular. And so I want to talk with those two examples and just what your reactions were, because I have no idea what your reactions were to those things. So the first one that I want to talk about is, as mentioned, the Cathedral of San Antonio, which I think twice a night for about 3 years now has done a history of San Antonio itself, the history of Cincinnati projected on the edifice of the church. This is a very storied church. Very, very old cathedral. Davy Crockett and all of the guys who fought at the Alamo are entombed in this church, despite themselves fighting the Catholic Spanish at the Alamo. So I'm not really sure how that worked, but they've got a big...
It's a little complicated.
They've got a big tomb in there.
Work.
So it's very, central to the kind of Catholic identity of that part of Texas. Very centrally located in this big square. And every night they do this really vivid history of San Antonio, not narrative, or like not narrated, I guess I should say narrative, not narrated, but with music and kind of cool imagery. And then the other video I sent you was, as also mentioned, the projection show on Cinderella's castle, where about halfway through the light, they're projecting scenes from their films on the facade of this building, with the building itself kind of taking on the persona of the different structures from the films. And about halfway through, maybe a third through, Cinderella's castle itself becomes Notre Dame Cathedral. And we see, statues of saints rise up, and we see the rose window form, and we see Quasimodo begin to, from, Disney's Hunchback of Notre Dame in the 90s, kind of swing from the rafters, which is a cool thing, because one of the big things that Disney is criticized for now is that they really only put out, they only celebrate in the parks the movies that have made like a gajillion dollars and are super recent. And that cannot be said of Hunchback of Notre Dame at all. So it is purely an artistic and stylistic choice that they chose to include a very long scene of a character just kind of leaping around the rafters of a Gothic architectural church. And so I saw those as cool bookends to send you, where we have this very religious, beautiful scene being projected on kind of an excessively secular edifice. And then on the other side, we have this very secular history being projected on a pretty explicitly religious edifice. And I'm just wondering, as a student of the arts and as a priest, what your reaction to those two things were, just even on an emotional level.
Yeah, no, definitely. I found the San Antonio one to be really gripping, like really fascinating. I had no idea that that's an ongoing thing. And I thought it was really gripping. I mean, some of what they do is really stunning. There's this really cool, it starts out like the first thing where it's sort of like a pre intro is there's this, the whole wall of the church becomes exterior wall of the church becomes a cave wall on which there are cave drawings, and it's clearly like, I'm assuming this is like the earliest art from that physical area. And so like the first thing that happens, the way that like this art form in and placed here comes into existence, is this like meta commentary about the development of art in San Antonio and the development of art as a human experience, which is incredibly amazing. It's really, really powerful because, for lots of reasons, but one of them is that, this early art, like this cave art and stuff that you see, and like rock art and stuff that you see, is often really intensely religious, like, usually, in fact, like really intensely religious. And so like it makes sense that there as this whole kind of meta commentary on the way in which like the human heart's desire for God generates the space in which the search for art happens, is really cool. Like, yeah, I don't think that's what the...
Oh, you go ahead. Oh, I was just gonna say, the history of art and the history of the Venn diagram, I guess, between the history of art and the history of human spirituality is pretty much a circle, and right, you feel like it's pointing that out, yeah,
which is really cool. I really like that. Again, like, do I think that that's exactly what the person who made that was suggesting? Like, well, I doubt it, but I also don't really care. So Um, and then there are all these really cool things in it where they're just using the space as a church building like in such a cool way. There's this incredible kind of breathtaking moment actually when like the church itself is kind of built, but built as this like mega 17th century Spanish Baroque colonial mission thing. And so it's like so cool. You see these like pillars grow up out of nowhere, and then these saints descend onto them, and then like everything gets like even like they're using the actual contours of the real building, but they sort of massively baroqueify them in this like Spanish colonial kind of way that's like really breathtaking. So for, the next 4 minutes or so of the show, you're really standing in the presence of this Spanish colonial sort of wonder come to life. And that I also think is like really, really gripping. So a lot of that installation I thought was really powerful, just for like helping you to see, again, like we were talking last time about just like how do you, what's the thing that you can do to like experience beauty in your life is like, well, like learn how to see it. And one thing that's really powerful about architecture is that it's always around you, always waiting to be seen and to be seen again, and to transform you by letting you see it again. But if it's a building that you've seen 100,000 times, like you can begin to lose. It's a common fault of the mind that you stop paying attention, you stop seeing it, really seeing it. And the cool thing about this kind of thing is that it forces you to really see the church for like a long time and reflect on it as a space and reflect on its like place in the history of San Antonio and the history of Texas and all these things. And I think that just alone is really valuable, actually, like a powerful and a valuable thing.
Yeah, and I like the way you say that because it is such a relational art form. They're not mapping when they map the data points of the facade, they're not just kind of, scanning it like, you kind of imagine like a green light, like scanning down over the building like a copier, right? They're not doing that. Right, exactly. They're literally, measuring in on the XYZ axes from relationship to where the projector is going to be. And where you stand in relationship to it changes how you view the show as well. So it's all spatial. It's all, not unlike how you would see painting in a museum, but even more so. There's this very kind of relational, communal aspect to, where you're standing in proportion or in relation to the actual edifice. What did you think of the Disney one?
I was that was the one I was least impressed by, honestly.
Okay.
And I think I don't know, probably for various reasons, but like, for the most part, actually, interestingly, with the exception of that passage that you're talking about at where they sort of reinvent Notre Dame Cathedral, with the exception of that passage, which really, it was actually a different thing about it that really caught my attention, but that was the one part of the whole thing that really caught my attention. With the exception of that, I thought it was just kind of like, I thought that their freedom to work as artists and to actually generate like something fascinating with the potentiality of this medium was really kind of hamstrung by just like, oh, look, it's Jafar. Oh, look, it's Queen Ursula. Like, oh,
Yeah.
look, you just kind of like the hamstrung by having to just sort of like force feed their own product content.
Right. The IP. Yeah.
Where like the really then sort of suddenly in the middle comes this thing that is like really unexpected that obviously is still exactly their IP, but breaks out of that, where it's not just kind of like selling a product, like it actually is using a product, using a story that's already been told, usually using a visual language that's already been mapped, literally, to explore something new. And I thought that was super successful and really interesting. The rest of it I did not find to be as immersed in its own artistic language.
So I want to hear more about what you feel like that scene was successful at, but I'll tell you a quick funny story about that show. So I love that show, which will be a surprise to nobody. It's very sort of like we've joked before. Have we joked on this podcast itself or just between us about the hero's journey? And
there's only one way to find out.
Yeah, we have to go back and listen to everything. But we've definitely joked before together about the hero's journey and like that, the book that suggested that theme kind of getting, sort of proving itself true, self-fulfilling prophecy in media and things like that. And the show is very, very hero's journey for those who haven't seen it. It's, you hear like the deep, robustly voiced narrator come up and talk about how we're all part of a story, and then we, there's like a section for adventure and there's a section for like friendship and there's a section for parents and there's a section for spirituality and there's a section for triumphing over adversity. And then they kind of close out with an achieving your dreams. So it's very sort of like we're all hero's journey. And then we're going to categorize all these different scenes from our IP that it's, only coincidental that those IPs were very financially successful. And show your place in the story. I recognize it's capitalistic. I recognize it's manipulative. I fall for it hook, line, and sinker. I went to a conference in Orlando a couple years ago. And afterwards, our mutual friend, John, flew out to go to Walt Disney World with me for one day. We'd always wanted to go together. And so he literally flew out like at 6 a.m. that morning. We spent the entire day in the Magic Kingdom, and he flew out at like 2 a.m. the next day, technically. So he was literally not even in Orlando for 24 hours, and it was the full Disney Death March, as they say. But we closed out the night with this show, and I'm just about as sentimental and artistic as a person can be, and John is just about as, and he won't be offended by my saying this, but sort of like spectrum engineer kind of as a person can be. And we watched this show, and he's a little shorter than me, so I propped my arm on his shoulder and used him as a human tripod to record it with my phone. And the show ends and I'm openly weeping. Like I'm actively weeping over how inspired I feel by this thing. And I look over at him and I said, wasn't that just so amazing? And he goes, yeah, the technology was really impressive.
Oh. So incredible. The thing is, how do they invent this? Yeah. And then
I actually told that amazing story at his wedding. When I was the best man at his wedding, I told that story there. But that's pretty much a good explanation of our relationship, and then also of my sentimentality when it comes to lame Disney crap like that. So I do fall hook, line, and sinker for it. But without further ado, what did you find particularly successful about that scene, and what did you find less successful about the rest of it? I mean, there's obviously kind of like a bias that we're gonna have against a multinational, conglomerate showing its stories up there and wanting us to cry over it. But if you can get past that, what did you feel like was successful about the Hunchback scene, and what wasn't about the rest?
With a Hunchback, so there's this one particular moment that is super neat. They're like the Hunchback is like on the top of a ladder or something, and he like sets off a firework, mm-hmm. And then it like goes out, and then it's a real firework.
Yeah.
And like this is really impressive, right? This is using the capacities of the medium. So I mean, it's literally multimedia, and you're using the capacities of the medium in this just like insane way. Like, what if we had mapped visual art, like moving artwork, who sets off imaginary firework that then is so perfectly timed with a real firework that when that streak of light leaves the building, that it joins up with a real firework that is also leaving at that same point, and then it goes off. Like, that's amazing. It's amazing not just from a technical perspective, like how do they do it, but also it's just like there's a vitality, a creativeness, like it's explosive. Like it's an explosive sort of like
Literally, yeah.
moment of joy,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that like this is so cool. Like look at this. It's just this kind of like free proclamation of joy. I love it. I love that.
As a priest, I mean, I mentioned already that it doesn't really make sense that Disney threw this scene in there from the values that the company currently seems to hold, where, like, have you ever been to Epcot at all?
No.
Okay, so Epcot is their big kind of like science center, but as a theme park. And historically, had no IP in it at all, no intellectual property in it at all. And then under the current Disney leadership, people joke that it's now Epcot, IP caught, because they're just rolling out character after character that ham-fistedly, just doesn't fit at all. And so it really doesn't fit with the current kind of Disney ethos that they would put this scene from a movie that even in its own day kind of bombed and was seen as being, even back then, way too serious and way too mature for the target audience. What did you make, like, as a priest and as someone who doesn't have the same affection for Disney that I do, of the fact that the artists behind the show and presumably the suits who approved of that show saw fit to put that scene in there?
Oh, I don't know. I guess I didn't really think about it. It's a fair point. I didn't know all that stuff going around behind it. I don't really know. I mean, it's visually stunning, right? So, and it's taking, it's a meta artwork that lets you exploit one of the world's great and best known artworks, this architectural wonder of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And it lets you sort of like comment on it by generating it yourself and interacting with it and engaging with it. So as an artist and a creator, like it's this interesting way of like, both kind of paying homage to, and then also making your own, one of the world's best known, kind of like triumphs of like visual wonder. And then you get to like literally play around inside it and like celebrate it in your own kind of a way. So that's kind of all the more I thought was going on there. Like I didn't find the scene itself like any more inherently religious or whatever than anything else in it. I just think that like you're sort of engaging you're engaging a little bit more with a building as a building per se. I think that was my thought.
No, I think that's an interesting point. I think my bias as someone who is passionately Catholic and really into Disney is that if you're doing a story about the hero's journey, you really can't do that completely without some nod to spirituality. And so I felt like it was there, however manipulatively, to like play off of that chord in the heart. But I do think you're right, and I think it pivots us nicely into the question I wanted to pose to you in this episode, that projection mapping as a brand new art form is giving us a new way to encounter old but incredibly beautiful and impressive art forms in a new way. I mean, you made that point with the San Antonio Cathedral and being able to study that facade anew, but even recreating the facade of Notre Dame and putting it in a totally secular space, in a tourist space, does a similar thing. And I think that's interesting that it's kind of going both ways. It's coming through both doors into the house. So here's sort of the question, and I'll set this up by introducing another one of the videos that I sent you. There was a video, I believe it was an Episcopal church, where just like totally outside of the liturgy, like just, in the same way that sometimes churches will host like a concert or something, especially Protestant ones. They did a projection mapping show on the surfaces of the interior of a church. Now we could spend a good long time talking about whether or not we thought that was appropriate, but I want to pose an idea to you. One of the other clips I sent, which might be familiar to some of our listeners, is a clip from the movie Thor Ragnarok, which is the third film in the kind of the Thor trilogy thus far.
It's also known as the good one.
Yeah, the only good one. Taika
Yeah, I said
Waititi
that.
is a boss. And so in that scene, we see kind of a fresco styled after kind of cathedral frescoes on the ceiling of the palace in Asgard, I guess is where they're all from, the Norse god planet. And the fresco is very subtly moving, not excessively, but if you look closely, like Odin's halo, which is again a reference to, Catholic frescoes, because Viking gods weren't depicted with halos, but Odin's halo is spinning very slowly, and the arm is reaching very slightly for the spear, and the clouds are moving very slowly. This impression of movement to kind of catch the eye and bring you closer into it. So here's my pitch. One of the things we have not seen done, or at least that I personally not seen done very often with projection mapping, with one notable exception that I'll talk about in a second. None of the examples I can think of have been terrifically subtle.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm wondering what you would think, and I want your genuine reaction to this, but I'm wondering what you would think of the idea where you and I have both encountered often going into a church where it has a lot of beautiful architectural space, but it's got these gaps of like massive white space, just huge amounts of white space on either end of the altar or sometimes in the dome. And it would obviously be a huge undertaking, and feasibly it's arguable, but I find myself wondering, could you use a subtle form of projection mapping with the same kind of subtle movements and fresco style of the like as in Thor Ragnarok, or even like impressions of stained glass? Could you do very subtle projection mapping on the white space of a church during the readings that basically showed animated frescoes, or subtly animated frescoes or subtly animated stained glass depicting the readings that were being read? I'm thinking about this because we're talking about how projection mapping could be, the evolution of public arts. Churches themselves partially, we talked about this last episode, partially functioned and are meant to function as public arts. It is the idea that Catholics have among other, or it's the Catholic idea, that human beings have among their other basic human rights, like food and water, the right to beauty, and churches are partially there and made accessible to be an active and open place for rich and poor, young and old to experience beauty. And stained glass and frescoes are a form of beauty that was there as a teaching tool. So, if you got bored during the homily, or if you can't read, you can still determine all the gospels and those things around you. And I would never agree with like putting up little like scenes or clips from like a movie on a TV in a church space, because then your eyes are being drawn off the altar. But projection mapping does something different, right? It gives us a chance to study the architecture anew. It gives us a chance to draw our eyes to a center space. And what if behind Father, while he reads the gospel on the white space of the dome, as he's reading the story of the multiplication of the loaves and the fishes, we see a fresco of Jesus come to life and the fish actually multiply. And then it closes down and just turns into some kind of looping thing of clouds or something behind it for the remainder of the Mass. It would just be something to enhance the narrative elements. We wouldn't distract from the Eucharist. We wouldn't distract from any of the homily or any of the really important stuff. But the readings themselves being augmented, literally augmented reality with this, I really like it. But I also, as I said before, I'm not a classics guy, and I'm sort of, hated by a lot of liturgists, right? So what do you think of this idea at first thought?
Yeah. So I don't know, so let me answer in a little bit of a roundabout way. So, you sent this video of a church to me. The particular one that you sent me to was it's the Martin Luther Kirche in Dresden.
Oh, okay, that's what it was.
So
thank you for reminding me. Yeah.
So it's be a German evangelische Kirche, and
now you're just flexing your language skills.
We're doing it. So it's which is just interesting. So this is a whole it's a whole ecclesial tradition that's built on like the priority of the word and like the scriptures, and like there are offshoots from, not exactly, Lutherans themselves don't exactly go this direction, but there are offshoots that come from it that become what we call aniconic, so they believe that you shouldn't have any visual representations at all, and certainly not of human figures. And so in the Martin Luther Kirche in Dresden, you see there's this, the dome of the apse, the central apse, they do this projection mapping thing, with this kind of like patterns and these interesting sort of like webs and things. And it's just, it's just patterns, sort of visual patterns, totally non-narrative, and not like, people tweaking on kinds of the, not the visualizer kind of patterns, but just like cool sort of like these interesting and meditative sort of patterns that people are just kind of sitting there and looking at.
Yeah, Northern Lights kind of stuff.
Kind of Northern Lightsy type stuff. And it was interesting because I thought like as a visual pattern, as like a thing to experience, it was really cool, but it really did seem to me to be at odds with the space in which it found itself.
I agree.
Which is a problem because like it seems to me like one of the the power of the art form of projection mapping is like this really deep integration with the space, with the particularity of the space. And this seemed really not to work, in part because, you have it's this kind of Baroque-y, a little, just some like the, elaborations and ornamentation and stuff. It's like kind of Baroque-y, and then you have these sort of very modern, postmodern-y kind of like these lines and these patterns, these webs that move and collapse and turn into something else. And the whole just visual aesthetic about it was like totally opposite to what the church was. And so it's like this clash all the time. So I would find the experience like it's not doing what it wants, what it's supposed to help you do,
right?
Integrate into the space. But then also conceptually with it, one thing that's important and kind of interesting that this is in like a church that comes from the tradition of Martin Luther, is that like there is no word here. Like this is an iconism that actually then kind of triumphs over the word in this really interesting way.
Damn.
Like, because it's, there are visual representational images in the church. There's representational stained glass and all this kind of stuff. But then like, because what you've gathered there to reflect on is these like aniconic kind of like light patterns, and there is no proposal of the word there. Like the word doesn't live there. And so it's not going to draw you in any closer. It's just an interesting domed space on which to project I found personally aesthetically attractive kind of visual art, dynamic visual art.
Yeah.
So I think already when you're talking about something in the interior of a church, that suddenly you're in a whole world of complication,
sure,
of like how things signify, how people interact with spaces, that I think then become really difficult. So that's an example of, in a couple different formalities, how I think that doesn't work as a use of a church space for church purposes.
Sure. Let me also interject there. You're totally right that the projection mapping, stylistically, aesthetically, was kind of at war with the architecture of that church space. But I think from a totally like agnostic, secular, artistic perspective, the same can be said in reverse as well. The architecture of the church really clashed with the aesthetics, so they really were at war with and undermined each other. So I think you're making a really valuable artistic point, which is that your media got to mesh, and if your media don't mesh, it's not good art.
No, that's exactly right. Like, yeah, no, thank you for pointing that out, because I don't at all mean like, oh, I feel threatened as the church,
Right,
like, no,
right.
I don't, no, it's just that this doesn't work as a work of art because it's clashing with itself,
Hmm.
it's like when you go, sometimes this happens, you go to a museum, um, and there's this like nice work of art, but this will often happen with things that were framed in like the late 19th and early 20th century. It'll be this nice work of art, but often kind of simple or whatever. And some buffoon just drowned it in this like 5-inch thick gold, like rococo kind of frame. Like you can't even see the painting because of the frame. And it makes you want to barf, like it's like that only on steroids, where it's just like, well, this doesn't work.
You go, Glenn
Sorry.
Rococo.
Yeah. Exactly. So I think there's that, that we have to pay attention to the whole thing. So okay, fine. The whole reality in which it's ensconced, great. That's cool. I think that, by the way, like art forms have strengths and they also have temptations and weaknesses. Like one of them is going to be simply literally trying to replace the thing that you're mapping,
Right. How do I complement
so
this, support this without replacing it or undermining it? Yeah.
exactly, so I think that's a big thing, which would be really cool. Okay. So now let's think just totally hypothetically about like thinking about this being inside a church, an extant church space. I don't know. I have concerns. So like particularly what you just proposed is a kind of like semi-narrative, even though it's a very mild motion. It's kind of semi-narrative proposal of like illustrating readings as they're happening. That risks only illuminating what is least important about the scene at hand.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Elaborate.
Which is its kind of strictly sort of material, this is what happened sort of element, like here's an illustration in a book or whatever. Like we don't read these texts at mass to remember what happened. And we don't read them just to think about like, oh, maybe it looked like this, or oh, maybe it looked like that. And even like visual art, the purpose isn't to say like, oh, well, this happened, and like, oh, maybe it looked like that, maybe it looked like that. It's to like, when we read these things so that the word of God is present among us, right? Like that's why we don't have the notion about the sacrality of a Bible that Muslims have about the Quran. Like the Bible contains the word of God, and the word of God comes to be when we proclaim it and hear it and encounter him, so like he comes to be in the event. Like the word of God is always an event, it's an event whom we encounter, a person we encounter. And it's in this living reality of proclaiming it. And like, this is why it's so important to read it every time we at mass or whatever, is like that it's this encounter with the living word who actually changes me as such. So just the kind of like this happened and then this happened element is sort of like the least important thing. And I worry that this is going to turn into that this could, even at the hypothetical level, just be too simplistically like, well, then this happened, an illustration of the thing that is least important about it. Like Jesus did this.
So to play devil's advocate, couldn't you lodge that same criticism at statues, at stained glass, at any of those things? I mean, you're talking about how, Martin Luther and then those who came after him sort of reject iconography of all forms. And it seems to me to come from a distorted model of what you're saying, which is that, the visual has the potential to distract from the encounter of the word. So
right.
Would you lodge that same criticism at stained glass and statues? If not, why? Could any defense of stained glass and statues be used to defend an application of projection mapping liturgically the way I'm talking about? I'm just curious your thoughts there.
Yeah, I'd say no, or not necessarily, because the point of those things, and this is where the permanence thing is important. this is where the permanence thing is important, is that the point of those things is that they are there to be beheld, to be contemplated at the beholder's leisure, and over long periods of time with lots of reflection and engagement. And so a well done piece of sacred art. Now, I mean, I say sacred art, I mean art that properly belongs in a church building, because by its nature, its whole purpose for why it was made and like how it was ordered and like where it was placed is to like unveil to the senses something about the invisible God, particularly in the context of, say, if it's a Catholic church, the liturgy. Okay, so this is something that part of its drama, a gigantic part of its drama and its importance, is that it's always there, that I can go to it and I can go back to it and I can keep looking at it and I can keep engaging with it. And maybe like the first 100 times I see it, it doesn't really mean anything. Then the 132nd time something clicks and it begins to like open up for me. And then this begins to like expand in me, this new way of understanding something about who Christ is, even if it's a narrative scene, you know, like say the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, or the miraculous draft of fishes, you know, where he pulls up whatever it is, 152 fish or whatever. That there is something more here that's happening, that like the best, I mean, the most successful as sacred art doesn't just sort of like, here this happened. But it's a whole theological development of an unpacking of the drama, so that my contemplation of this work of art over the course of time, something about the Word of God can become living and effective in me. I can gain new depth of insight and understanding, that it is itself a theological reality that invites me in to reflect theologically on the glory of God in this particular like scene or topos or whatever. But you see, this is where I think like we have to be careful with projection mapping, even as a concept, is that ephemerality is built into it. And I think that's not, I propose that at the beginning as a criticism, and I regret that. Like, I don't think we should think of it as a weakness or a criticism, but we have to accept that it's part of its nature and we shouldn't fight against it. So don't put an ephemeral thing in a place where you need a permanent thing. Okay. And you can put an ephemeral thing where you can't put a permanent thing. So why don't we take advantage of that? So for instance, just when you were talking, like when you're saying, well, what about a church space? One thing that came to my mind, now this could also be this could be a terrible idea. I don't know. I was thinking more like, what do you do when you want to have you want to worship in a space that isn't sacred? It's really hard, right? Like, so there you can do, I mean, like, you know, we'll bring with us like a crucifix, we'll bring with us candles, we'll bring with us, at the very least, those things that like by their emplacement, they create a sacred space around them, you know, like this drama of like lighting a candle that like where you can see the light, it generates this kind of sacredness of the space. It's very powerful, very beautiful. It's just like the heart and the mind are naturally drawn to that. Well, okay, now again, we're prescinding from limitations of like budget and practicality.
This is
we're just
all
brainstorming.
blue sky,
This is just, Now, what if you could get something like this that would just work for like a blank four-walled room, like a multi-purpose room, like every stupid like community center or like gym or whatever space has, and I could just set this thing up and like turn it on, and like it would throw around me a sacred space.
That's a very cool idea, and I think you're right, because you know, I agreed with you even at first watching, even before we talked about this. I shared your sentiment in regards to Martin Luther Church, that the aesthetics of the art were at odds with the aesthetics of the architecture and vice versa, right? That was something that I intuited. I hadn't really intuited this idea of one of the inherent factors of the art form being its ephemerality. I didn't really consider that. It makes sense when you talk about it, but I do share your opinion that we need to lean into what makes an art form unique instead of just fighting it. And so you're right. As much as I kind of like my idea, aesthetically, I think you're right. It does inherently fight one of the factors of the art form. And I like that your idea is taking inspiration from that factor and saying, okay, so this is an ephemeral art form. How can we look at ephemeral spaces and kind of expound upon them like that? And what you're talking about, I mean, I think is possible in some form. There's a Halloween company that is kind of rolling out home use projection mapping softwares. It's very rudimentary, but basically you can hang a sheet in your window and then it will project like a ghost or something like behind that sheet. So basically you can still see through the window because it's like a thin film sheet. You can still see through the window. You can see everything going on, but then you can see like a ghost walking past the window. Or they've invented a version of that where you can buy, you buy the projector and it's pre-built to project on sort of a round surface. And so you can project like a singing face onto pumpkins that you buy. Any pumpkin you buy, you can put it on, and then, across your lawn, you put this little projector and suddenly the pumpkin's singing and, blah, 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 spooky songs, right? And so, we're starting to roll out tech like that. And I do think that, I've been to, praise and worship things at colleges. I've been to, Catholic events in gyms. I've been to all those things. And I love the idea of being able to just turn that almost magically into a more ethereally mystical space. That's a really cool idea.
This idea just occurred to me, but even just hearing you describe it, like, I'm excited. I would be so excited for this. I would be so excited for this because, like, now again we're trying to, because here's the problem when you're in a situation like that and you're trying to pray, is that like your prayer is fighting against the space is fighting against your prayer, and it's awful, and like, prayer is a supernatural reality, and so like, by the grace of God, like you can pray anywhere, and like this all works. But again, like we have our body has a language, and like when everything about the space is fighting against it, it just becomes everything becomes just that much harder, know? And I just, oh my gosh, it would be exciting. I mean, it would be so cool if you could just say like, give me a room of like X dimensions that's just basically a big, like four blank walls, and like I can just tell you where I can program in somehow where the doors are, and then like I just press a button and I just get someone's imagination of like a crypt church, because of course like these crappy spaces never have windows, so just like something that uses the limitations of the space to explode it, so like now I'm in a crypt church, and yes, it's dark, it has to be dark, and the only real light are the candles that are physically candles, but like, what a drama, but like, I mean, a real drama, not manipulative, that lets people encounter the space in the way they're going to encounter the space, that like lifts up their prayer and becomes more of a pathway for their prayer. So they're not fighting against the space anymore, but the space is somehow helping them to like enter into the presence of God. I mean, that stuff would be so cool.
And this is so cool. What you're hitting on is a general thing that I think is going to play into a lot of our episodes, especially these ones where we look at a specific art form or a specific current artist, where, I'm friends with a lot of secular artists who are working to push the envelope of the medium. And I'm friends with a lot of sacred artists who are in a perpetual state of looking backwards. They want to look at how we used to do things. How is Latin music of this type written? How is, paintings of this type done? And I think there's value in both of those things, but I think there's so much value in both of those things that I wish there was greater collaboration. I don't know how many liturgical designers with the knowledge to be able to say what you just said, where you're like, hey, that wouldn't be an appropriate use of this art form, but this over here would be. I don't know how many liturgical artists are even aware that a tech like this exists. And I don't know of very many technical artists, modern secular artists working within projection mapping, for instance, who would care. And so
Right.
if you're listening to this, we often kind of end these episodes with some kind of invitation to you, because, in the same way that, that public art or art in general is communal and relational. We want this podcast to be relational with you, the listener. We pray for you before these episodes. And we want you to interact with us, not just in this sort of like and subscribe and hit the notification bell way, but like genuinely, we want to be able to interact with you. And if you're listening to this and you're on either side of that spectrum, if you're a liturgical or sacred artist who has a charism for the old and for the way things were, or if you're, more of an artist in a secular space, really pushing the envelope, I encourage you to explore that other side of the spectrum. Because there is, as Father Gabriel's pointing out, there's so much room to complement the old with the new and to fulfill the new with the old. This is something even, Father Gabriel, you preached at my wedding. That's very close to my heart, right? Christ is ever ancient, ever new, right? He is the new wine and the wineskin. And so there's this artistic element of saying, okay, how can I even build on the old cool stuff with the created things, so to speak, the old created things with the new created things? And how can I fulfill and deepen the new creative things with the old created things? Very cool. Very cool. I love these ideas, and I hope and pray sincerely that they'll inspire other ideas for our listeners.
That's fantastic. I couldn't agree more, and frankly, I want that to have the last word. That's beautiful. So, my friends, thank you for listening. Go forth and create cool things.
This has been Created Things, an art, soul, and mind production with Jacob Flores Popchak and Father Gabriel Torretta. Production by Kyle Meineke and Jessica Flores. Theme song by Federico Carranza. For more on the podcast and on its hosts, visit artsoulandmind.com.